You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
A rendezvous with destiny. It was only a dream a quarter of a century ago. Back then, Ronald Reagan was in Hollywood, hosting a television series, Death Valley Days. His ideas were branded extremist. Today, Reagan is entering history as one of the most important presidents of this century. Now, his ideas are transforming our politics.
More than anything else, I want my candidacy to unify our country, to renew the American spirit and sense of purpose. I want to carry our message to every American, regardless of party affiliation.
The rise of conservatives to take over the Republican Party and then the White House climaxes a long, often bloody civil war. Its roots stretch back to the 1940s, when there were two wings to the party. One was Midwestern, conservative, isolationist. It sent Republicans to Congress. The other, the establishment wing, was Northeastern, moderate, internationalist. It controlled the party's presidential nominations, trying to send men like Tom Dewey and Dwight Eisenhower to the White House, often over conservative objections. In 1960, Richard Nixon, Ike's vice president, was the establishment's choice for president. Trying to rally the conservatives at the Republican convention that year, Senator Barry Goldwater set off some fireworks. It is here that our story really begins.
We've had our chance, we've fought our battles. Now let's put our shoulders to the wheel of Dick Nixon and push him across the line. Let's not lag back. This country and its majesty is too great for any man, be he conservative or liberal, to stay home and not work just because he doesn't agree. Let's grow up, conservatives. Let's, if we want to take this party back, and I think we can someday, let's get to work.
Goldwater had become the leader of a new conservative rebellion. In a pattern we shall see repeatedly on this program, he and other conservatives thought their party leaders, Eisenhower and Nixon, were too soft on the welfare state. Goldwater openly split with President Eisenhower in 1957.
I called his budget that he submitted a dime store New Deal because we weren't breaking away, in my opinion, fast enough from the so-called welfare state, which has since taken the country over.
He is the man who will succeed Dwight D. Eisenhower next January. Richard E. Nixon.
Goldwater could not stop the Nixon nomination in 1960. But when Nixon lost the general election to John Kennedy, warfare broke out in Republican ranks. Conservatives went to work to draft Goldwater for the 1964 nomination. Moderates went to work to stop him, labeling him a reactionary, a primitive.
He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not obviously because he was a racist. He's not a racist, nor is Ronald Reagan, but because they thought it was an unwarranted intrusion of big government into people's affairs, into the private sphere.
And he is the man who, after the greatest campaign in history, will be Mr. President. Barry Goldwater.
Goldwater mowed down the moderates and claimed the party's nomination in 1964 to the cheers of grassroots Republicans. He said he offered Americans a choice, not an echo.
The Republicans historically, for 100 years since the Civil War, had been a laissez-faire party. What Reagan, but first Goldwater, added on to that was social and foreign policy conservatism. That had not been part of the Republican tradition. In other words, what Goldwater did is he made the Republican Party consistently conservative across the board.
And we must make clear that until its goals of conquest are absolutely renounced and its relations with all nations tempered, communism and the governments it now controls are enemies of every man on earth who is or wants to be free. I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
That speech was one of the most memorable and controversial in American politics.
And we took that speech from Socrates and then from Cicero. We didn't change much in it, we just gave it. And I still think it's one of the greatest statements that's ever been made, and it's still applicable today. The word extremism just bugged the hell out of some of the Pennsylvania people, New York people, New England people.
The New York delegation, led by Senator Ken Keating, was bugged enough that it walked out. Many Republican moderates refused to help Goldwater in the election. They ganged up with the opposition and the press, painting him as an extremist.
I don't want to see this nation move down a fascistic path, and I think we are in danger of that if Senator Goldwater is elected, and I will do everything within my power and within my means to aid people of goodwill in seeing that Senator Goldwater is not elected President of the United States.
On October 24th, 1963, Barry Goldwater said of the nuclear bomb, merely another weapon. Merely another weapon. Vote for President Johnson.
Goldwater never had a chance, and he knew it.
I was sitting up in my hotel room in San Francisco putting the finishing touches on my acceptance speech, and over in the corner of the Princeton Research was showing me a flip chart where I was 20 and Johnson was 80. And I said, why don't we quit writing this acceptance speech and write one and tell them to go find somebody else? They all laughed about it.
The Democrats gave Republicans one of the biggest shellackings in history that year. But from the debris came major changes. Goldwater changed the whole direction of the Republican Party, and he inspired thousands of young conservative activists to join up.
Well, Barry Goldwater was like a breath of fresh air. I mean, he said, the Old West lives on, the pioneer spirit. He really, as I said to the Republican National Convention about Barry Goldwater, he was an inspiration not only to me, but to a whole generation of people who were coming into politics and who were attracted by him and by his idealism, his commitment, his sense that this is a great country and anything is possible.
The major thrust of the campaign became one to get control of the Republican Party away from the eastern seaboard and move it out here to the boondocks, move it out west of the Rocky Mountains, west of the Mississippi River, and we did that.
Thank you and good evening.
Goldwater brought one more change, more important than all the rest. Against the better judgment of his advisors, he let a 53-year-old actor from California deliver a nationwide television address on behalf of his campaign 1 week before the '64 election. It was the most important debut of any politician since William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold speech.
I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Do they believe that poverty is suddenly going to disappear by magic? Well, in all fairness, I should explain there is one part of the new program that isn't duplicated. This is the youth feature. We're now going to solve the dropout problem, juvenile delinquency, by reinstituting something like the old CCC camps. And we're going to put our young people in these camps. But again, we do some arithmetic and we find that we're going to spend each year just on room and board for each young person we help $4,700 a year. We can send them to Harvard for $2,700.
It looks now with this early days like Mr. Reagan has won this campaign.
Reagan won California by a landslide in 1966. Friends wanted him to take on Nixon for the 1968 presidential nomination, and he almost did. But the Republican establishment did not want to repeat the Goldwater experience. No more conservatives, they said. As the '68 elections approached, the country was tearing itself apart over Vietnam, campus turmoil, Black Power protests. The Democratic Party was self-destructing. George Wallace and many Southerners broke from the Democrats.
How about that when you're out
The late 60s and 70s, we went through a period of very deep questioning and doubt about the American experiment itself. In the course of the debates about the Vietnam War, there was some question as to, in many people's minds, whether we were a good country. Were our basic principles correct? Were we America or America with a K?
Thank you very much.
Nixon was more than ready, and his promise to bring the country together again carried him to the White House.
Nixon basically put the country back together again, and he really did, and people forget it, when the threat was very real from civil disturbance and from campuses, and the South wanted to go their way under George Wallace.
Kevin Phillips, a young supporter of Nixon, best understood the politics of 1968. In a book published that year, The Emerging Republican Majority, he argued that since the nation's population was moving to the Sun Belt, and by the way, he coined the phrase, the center of Republican gravity should move there too. Bring in the George Wallace vote. Bring in Catholics from the rest of the country, and Republicans can rule for years.
There's not one dime's worth of difference in the attitude of the National Democratic Party and the National Republican Party.
When George Wallace broke from the Democrats, he mobilized one of the largest third-party movements ever seen, winning 15% of the national vote in 1968. 4 years later, after Wallace was shot, his voters mostly went over to Richard Nixon. A new, historic coalition was forming for the Republicans.
The nation has made significant progress in these first years of the 70s. Our cities are no longer engulfed by civil disorders.
What kind of president was Richard Nixon? In domestic affairs, he was much more moderate than remembered.
Richard Nixon came out of that post-war experience, but clearly affected significantly by his 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president. Perhaps more ideological in his approach to governance than Eisenhower ever was, but very much an establishment figure, if you will, not a part of the Goldwater insurgency or the kind of movement that ultimately led Ronald Reagan.
Nixon is the father of black capitalism. No doubt about it. Democrats don't give us credit, give him credit for that. Nixon was one of the best presidents for helping blacks to become business owners rather than business employees.
He knew how to deal with the Congress, and so a lot of progress was made. He recognized it was live and let live, that you didn't take a conservative agenda and ram it down the throat of the Democratic Congress.
They include, among others, our programs to improve life for the aged, to combat crime and drug abuse, to improve health service, to ensure that no one will be denied needed health care because of inability to pay, to protect workers' pensions rights, to promote equal opportunity for members of minorities and others who have been left behind.
All the talk of new government programs once again left conservatives unhappy with a Republican president. Unlike Goldwater, Nixon seemed an echo, not a choice.
Nixon clearly was no conservative. We have a great society now, even to this day, because of Richard Nixon. Lyndon Johnson passed into law the Great Society. Nixon funded it.
Nixon's largest accomplishments were in foreign affairs. America has rarely had a team to match Nixon and Henry Kissinger. After a long traumatic period, they negotiated the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. Together, they opened the door to China. And they negotiated more treaties with the Soviet Union than any other administration in history. Détente reigned. Most of the country applauded. But again, a Republican president found some of his toughest critics were on the right. Nixon was retreating not only on free enterprise, but anti-communism, the two core beliefs of the post-Goldwater conservatives.
Many conservatives were opposed to any negotiations with the Soviet Union. And I believe then, and I believe now, that in a nuclear age, it is imperative to negotiate with the country that together with us has the capacity to destroy humanity. But they don't like the relativism implicit in the fact that you cannot make an agreement that is not also of some benefit to the other side.
But a time bomb was ticking away in the Nixon White House, of course, and in 1974 it exploded. Nixon always had a dark side, and he had succumbed to it. He became the first president in history to resign. throwing both his country and his party into chaos.
I went to him in February when Watergate was first bubbling. I said, please go on television and tell everybody in the country what happened. And then they're going to forget it and you can be president. But he wouldn't do it, and he kept on telling lie after lie after lie.
Gerald Ford would try to heal the nation's wounds, and those of his party, too.
I think Ford represented something of a bridge between Reagan, if you will, on the one hand, and the Rockefeller wing of the party on the other. He clearly was a mainstream Republican, as we define in the post-war period, essentially conservative on fiscal policy, believed in a strong national defense, but also basically pro-civil rights, supporter of the ERA.
I think Ford did a hell of a good job as president. Nothing earth-shaking or stupendous, but he did bring back dignity and honor to the White House, something that Nixon had destroyed, and Ford brought it back.
Goldwater always supported Ford, but Reagan and other conservatives did not. They thought he made a Faustian pact with the devil when he named Rockefeller his vice president. To appease the right, Ford had to throw Rocky off the ticket in order to run for president in 1976. The party's moderate wing, already shrinking, was now humiliated.
Mutual security is
There was a
feasible.
second area of deep controversy
essential.
between the moderates and the conservatives.
The United States also intends to pursue vigorously a further agreement on strategic arms limitations with the Soviet Union.
Ford continued the détente policies of Nixon, signing a major agreement with Soviet leader Brezhnev in Helsinki. Henry Kissinger, an old friend of Rockefeller's, took on an even larger role in foreign policy. Conservatives bellowed that Kissinger was responsible for an American retreat in world affairs.
Although Gerald Ford advanced policies that were not significantly dissimilar to those of Richard Nixon, conservatives were liberated from that code of silence to which they had bound themselves, and they began to generate dozens of new organizations, a lot of new energy.
Ronald Reagan led the conservative assault on President Ford, challenging him for the 1976 Republican nomination. It was a bitter, divisive struggle that went all the way to the convention. When Ford finally won, he was 30 points behind Jimmy Carter and could never catch up.
Basically, I think the success of the conservatives in the party was built on the failure of the moderates, because the conservatives could say, we gave you your chance. You had Nixon, you had Ford, and look what happened.
If conservatives had an unwitting ally in their rise to power, it was surely Jimmy Carter's Democratic Party of the late 1970s. Despite Carter's clear success in Middle East negotiations, Democrats seemed unable to cope with a dangerous world. The Ayatollah, OPEC, the spread of Soviet power.
They lost confidence in themselves and their capacity to be able to lead the nation. And this situation was ripe for the conservatives, especially in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, many of whom crossed over and were a key element of the Reagan constituency, to assert themselves.
As the left became more Baroque, it drove people like Bennett and Crystal and Kirkpatrick and Graham out of the Democratic Party. And you now have an ex-Democrat wing of the Republican Party chaired by Ronald Reagan. That is pretty amazing.
The neoconservatives, a small but highly influential group of Democratic intellectuals, left the party in dismay, joining up with Republicans.
I felt that the party was veering away, moving away from me. I was somebody who very much thought that John Kennedy was right when he said we shall bear any burden and pay any price in the defense of freedom in our hemisphere. I felt that the Democrat Party, the leadership, was moving away from that.
During the 1970s, millions of Americans, especially evangelicals, grew angry over Supreme Court decisions on abortion, school prayer, and crime, over feminism and the ERA, over gay rights. What struck many liberals as an expansion of personal freedoms struck them as an assault on the family and traditional values. Evangelicals had not been politically active for years. In 1976, they said enough and voted for Carter a born-again Christian.
What they're trying to do is make killing babies look respectable. It isn't respectable, and it never will be respectable.
The Christian right thus became a second critical group after the neoconservatives to move toward Republican ranks.
Fundamentalists and evangelicals have a long tradition, long history of political involvement. They were deeply involved in the anti-slavery movement. They were deeply associated with the Republican Party at one time in our national life, and then mostly with Democrats up until maybe the middle 1970s or the early 1970s. Their re-entry, the re-emergence of church people of that group, of the evangelical church, into American public life stems exactly from a feeling that we're a rich, prosperous, strong, decadent country. A country that is blessed with so much and yet has forgotten the source of our blessings, that we don't have the respect we ought to for human life, that we're not teaching our children our values, that our schools have been in decline, that drugs are a terrible problem, that somehow our national character has been eroded.
We believed somebody years ago who told us that religion and politics don't mix, that politics is dirty business. We should pray and preach, and that we're second-class citizens. Well, the World Council never believed that. William Sloane Coffin never believed that. The Barry brothers never believed that. When Dr. Martin Luther King was leading the civil rights movement as a Baptist pastor, he didn't believe that.
We know that we must now become involved in the government process of this nation.
Bible-believing Christians ought to be involved in politics. And that's true whether they're the evangelicals, or the fundamentalists, or the Catholics, or the Jews. People who have a strong spiritual motivation are almost commanded, in fact, I think they are commanded, to care about civil government. The risk, the danger is when somebody who has a deep spiritual motivation then tries to throw the mantle of Christ over some political program. I happen to believe deeply in a balanced budget, but I think it would be blasphemy to throw the mantle of Christ over the balanced budget amendment.
Helping to pull together the evangelicals in the late 1970s were leaders of what is now called the New Right. They are the social conservatives, hardline activists, to the right of Reagan himself. Richard Viguerie is a key organizer of the New Right. He pioneered the use of direct mail, using sophisticated computer-driven marketing techniques. Conservatives can now raise millions of dollars, far more than Democrats, and unite more easily behind their resentments.
We begin to reach out to the evangelicals, to the Christian right, to a lot of the religious community who had not been involved in politics, and asked them to participate in politics, and reached out to a lot of the blue-collar, the working men and women, the ethnics, conservative Catholics, and begin to put together a coalition that had some good effect on the 1978 election results. And then this coalition began to work for Ronald Reagan's nomination in 1980.
All the pieces were now in place for conservatives to capture not only the party, but the White House in 1980. They had a hero, Ronald Reagan. In truth, history will record that Jimmy Carter was a better president than he is now remembered to be. But events seemed to conspire against him. Inflation skyrocketed. State after state revolted against higher taxes. The nation was spinning beyond his control, and Carter seemed discouraged.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
They tell us they've done the most that could humanly be done. They say that the United States has had its day in the sun, that our nation has passed its zenith. They expect you to tell your children that the American people no longer have the will to cope with their problems, that the future will be one of sacrifice and few opportunities. My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view. We are going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people. We said something shocking. Taxes ought to be reduced, not raised. We cut the tax rates for the working folks of America.
When I had my own business during the Carter years,
the interest rates about killed me. About killed me, 21%. But between inflation and interest rates, as a woman business owner, seeing it eaten away. And subsequent to those years, I think that's why I got so truly committed to the Reagan economic policy that was based on the idea that you can spend your money better than the government.
It's morning again in America.
By 1984, that was the Republican soothing campaign message, and most voters agreed, returning Reagan to office in a landslide. But what about all those people left behind? And huge, growing federal debts. Some Republicans freely expressed concern today.
It wasn't enough just to run around saying morning again in America and taking out the old trumpet. So I think that's a real part of it. I also don't think that they understood the ambiguity of the economy and the extent to which there are two sides to this recovery. One is an extremely bright side for about 25, 30, 35% of the country, those that are doing well. They've never done as well. But there's another third of the country that's a lot more marginal, whether it's female-headed households or people in the countryside or minorities in the cities or people with part-time jobs. There's just a large group of Americans for whom the 80s have not panned out that terrifically.
This business of supply-side economics is a wonderful theory, but it didn't work. You know, the theory was we'll have supply-side economics and we will put all this money out there to raise, we won't raise taxes, but that'll stimulate the economy and it will create jobs, and the underprivileged will do better. Well, all I know is that we've got the biggest debt we ever had, and I'm not so sure where that ends up. And frankly, it concerns me about my children and my grandchildren.
There is a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see.
Looking overseas, Reaganites saw a dangerous, threatening world. Only a strengthened America, they said, could keep the peace.
Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Reagan came in, and what he did was restore the sense of America being back, in the sense of willingness to take the six gun out of the holster and use it. After the Carter years, that was a dimension that people wanted.
Initially, Reagan set out on the biggest defense buildup in American history. Just as he had led a political insurgency at home, he tried to lead one abroad, challenging the Soviets at the periphery of their empire. In Afghanistan, he succeeded. In Nicaragua, he failed. His foreign policy also worked to spread democracy to places like the Philippines. It stumbled badly in the Iran-Contra affair. But Reagan's most radical idea was in nuclear arms, to erect a defensive shield for the U.S. No one knows whether it will ever work, or its costs. But his defense initiative did help to bring the Soviets to the bargaining table, to negotiate a withdrawal of missiles from Europe. Reagan had taken the country to the right, but history was moving him toward the center.
He did set out, as you put it, to roll back the evil empire. He did it. The Soviet Union is withdrawing in Afghanistan and in Angola. The forcefulness and directness of the Reagan foreign policy, particularly in deploying arms in Europe, has brought the Soviet Union to the bargaining table and has resulted in an arms limitation treaty.
A lot of the hardcore conservatives felt angry, frustrated, embittered, and betrayed. Reagan hadn't paid off for them any more than Nixon or Eisenhower had. He hadn't delivered on the social agenda. His foreign policy was in tatters. He did an unthinkable thing. He sold arms to Iran. And to make it worse, he became the architect of a détente policy and gave up the evil empire rhetoric with respect to the Soviet Union.
He has redefined language. He has focused the country in a general direction. He has created a framework of prosperity and defense. And I suspect he figures he's done a pretty good job. And he's, at the vision level, he is the greatest leader we've had since Franklin Roosevelt.
It was here at the Republican convention in August that the Reagan era ended for the GOP, and the mantle of leadership passed to George Bush. At the presidential level, Republicans have won 4 out of the past 5 elections, usually by a landslide. George Bush is now riding that wave of history.
I seek the presidency to build a better America. It's that simple and that big.
But below the presidency, Democrats dominate our politics, holding roughly 2/3 of all the political offices in the land. For most of the past half-century, Democrats have controlled the House and Senate. Even so, many new voters are flocking to Republican ranks. White Southerners are in the midst of a revolution. Young people are also much more conservative than in the past.
The portion of the electorate which is most interested in the Republican ideas that have come to be known as the Reagan agenda are the 18 to 35-year-olds. They're the youngsters. They're the people who are attracted by the idealism, the optimism, the sense of creativity, the call to excellence, to work harder, to achieve more, to explore outer space, to find a cure for cancer, to start new businesses. Everything about what has come to be known as the Reagan Revolution, and that's not a bad title for it, but it encompasses so much more, is really about the future. It's not about the past.
Americans today are anxious to move on, to clean up old problems like the budget deficit, and face new ones unaddressed by Reagan.
Things aren't perfect in this country. There are people who haven't tasted the fruits of the expansion. I've talked to farmers about the bills they can't pay, and I've been to the factories that feel the strain of change, and I've seen the urban children who play amidst the shattered glass, the shattered lives, and there are the homeless. And you know, it doesn't do any good to debate endlessly which policy mistake of the 70s is responsive. They're there, and we have to help them.
Ironically, because of Ronald Reagan's success in two critical areas, peace, prosperity, people are now focusing on some harder questions. What do we do about drugs? How do we overcome the problems in our educational system? What do we do about AIDS? These are difficult and hard matters.
We've only built, I think, one steel mill in this country since 1940. Is it any wonder that Germany and Belgium and Italy, Russia now make most of the world's steel? No.
I think conservatives need to recognize that they have no hopes of broadening the base of the movement, the philosophy, if they cannot address some of the problems of the inner cities, of the poor, of the left out, of the homeless, and that there aren't market-oriented solutions.
Number one, we need a new agenda for civil rights in America.
For Republicans, the most innovative ideas for attacking the new issues on America's agenda are coming from a handful of governors and from House members to the right of George Bush. Progressive conservatives, they call themselves.
Why don't we think about something radical with housing? Why don't we suggest to those families who live in public housing that they have the opportunity to homestead? Mr. Lincoln gained the power of the presidency with homesteading in 1860. I would suggest that today in urban America, we ought to give families a chance to buy their own apartment, buy their own home at a reduced rate, and give them a chance to become property owners.
Even if they come up with new ideas, Republicans must also struggle with holding together their diverse coalition. Yuppies, libertarians, the Christian right, Roman Catholics. Ronald Reagan has been the glue that kept it together. But just beneath the surface, there are cracks and strains between old and new, moderates and conservatives, even among conservatives themselves.
We have had in the Republican Party people who are not conservatives. They're not even close to conservative. They're not even close to Republican philosophy.
Conservatives are serious about the issues of taxes and communism and the decline of moral values in this country. And we want a political vehicle to express these. And if the Republican Party is going to keep us at the back of the bus and refuse to deal with the issues and fight for these issues that we feel strongly about, something's going to have to give.
I don't think that conservatism is a spent force for the simple reason that I think that the country continues to move on a conservative path. It's one reason that I think that we have been as successful as we have been to date in erasing a 17 or 18-point deficit in the polls.
If he is elected this November, it will be up to George Bush to hold together the new Republican coalition, to lead it and the nation in building upon the successes of the past 8 years, and yes, in correcting the failures. As Ronald Reagan leaves the White House, Most Americans are grateful that during his presidency, the nation enjoyed a long period of peace and a growing economy. But Americans are also deeply concerned about old problems that have grown worse during the Reagan era and new ones that have surfaced. Towering budget and trade deficits, the plight of the homeless, pollution, crime, racial intolerance, and materialism sometimes carried to excess. Whether or not George Bush is elected in November, Republicans must now join in finding solutions. To those concerns, Republicans bring a set of principles that have united them over the past quarter century. They believe that the private enterprise system provides more freedom and better answers than big government. They believe that peace comes only through military strength. And they believe in family, community, and a higher being. The central question then is whether Republicans can put those beliefs to work, forcefully and effectively, in addressing the nation's future agenda. I'm David Gergen. Thank you.